Po przerwie. Szanowni Państwo, bardzo mi miło, że mogę gościć redaktora Pawła Lisickiego, redaktora naczelnego Do Rzeczy, ale również wybitnego znawcy religii, autora wielu książek i chciałbym, żebyśmy właśnie dzisiaj porozmawiali o dyskusji, która jest bardzo rzadka, albo czasem już teraz w dzisiejszych czasach już niespotykana, a myślę, że może być, mam nadzieję, że będzie dla Państwa ciekawa. Mianowicie chcemy porozmawiać w kontekście najnowszej książki pana redaktora, Kto fałszuje Jezusa, o racjonalnych dowodach na istnienie Boga. Otóż wielu, szczególnie myślę młodych ludzi dzisiaj, którzy nie mieli styczności, którzy nie mają styczności z chrześcijaństwem, uważają,
who had nothing to do with Christianity, they treat God as some superstition, and very often people are surprised when people say, ask if the God exists, they ask proof that it exists or proof he doesn't exist. And it's very difficult to have a recourse to any concrete evidence proving that Catholicism is both reason and faith. And today we're going to tackle this issue. So let's start with the book, an interesting book and an interesting experience. Anthony Flew, one of the most outstanding Oxford's philosophers, at the time the most known fighting atheist, invited to many discussions. But his history is well known because, surprisingly, he came to thinking that God exists. Let me quote from the book, and let's start our discussion from this. And professor says so. I have to stress that discovery of God came naturally to me without any recourse to any supernatural powers. It was via natural theology. It is not related to any standard religion, and I don't have any personal experience or supernatural experience of God. So that was the pilgrimage of my mind. So what changed his point of view? Discovery of DNA showing how complex living creatures are, and that it's impossible and there is no other explanation rather than the creator. So the interpretation from cosmology. So there is a world which is so ideally designed that it's impossible, as many people think, that it could be created in the course of a Big Bang. So first and foremost, thank you very much for having me today. I will not refer to this concrete argument because we could talk a lot about different authors supporting different topics, like, for example, Intelligent Project. There is such a group of experts representing different confessions. That group brings together Jews, Christians, and people who did not choose their conviction clearly. So one way to explain such phenomena like evolution, Big Bang, it's not Darwinism or neo-Darwinism, but there is something that they call a smart project, a project of a smart creator. So we could talk about it for hours, but something different is important. We have to become aware how important it is in the public debate to be convicted that there is mind and that faith is not just a feeling. It's not just a spur of emotions. It's not just a need of our psyche or a psychological need, but in the whole tradition of church, the element of getting to the faith preamble with use of mind was very important. So historically, the first, the Justin, the martyr, he used to be a philosopher, as he used to describe himself. He was a member of many philosophical schools, and he found reason and truth in Christianity. If we perceive the history of Christianity from that perspective, this support for mind is a key there. It was defined during the first Vatican conference. The fathers of the conference said that the existence of God can be revealed with mind by getting to know the world. So the conviction that the faith is an element of mercy and a God's gift. The whole theology and finding God as the creator of God can be found by every person, and every person is capable of that with the power of their mind. And before we refer to history, let me use and refer not only to our convictions, but let me quote some Nobel Prize winners. Although I'm a biologist, I don't understand how life was created. The possibility of existence of God is a satisfactory answer to this question. It was by Bernard Aber, the laureate of Nobel Prize in Medicine. Another Nobel Prize winners, Hans Crick, a genetist and biophysics, he said that with all knowledge that we have available, we might state that the beginning of life is a miracle. There are so many conditions that had to be met in order for life to be created. So, dear editor, these are not the only Nobel Prize winners. There are many outstanding personalities confirming that the way the world is designed, both the world of fauna and flora, it is so ideal and ideally matched that there is no possibility for that to be a random choice. All these arguments could be collected and were collected by metaphysicist Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, the greatest personality of the 20th century, in a simple argument stating that if something small cannot give birth to something big, so if we collect all arguments used in these discussions, no matter if it's a discussion about objective, so the finding objective in nature, or the argument of the first movement, the argument applied by Aristotle, and the Thomas Aquinas developed that thesis, or it may be something about the being, or the Augustinian thoughts, that if somebody says something necessary, or the first rules of logic, why they're universal, if everything which is surrounding us is one-off and without any pattern. So, question about the source of life. What was the source of life if there was no life before? So this theological proof, theological evidence, and how to arrive at spiritual life starting from senses. And we have this term of a soul, the definition of a soul applied by Plato, who says that there are some universal truths And the foundation is something material, so the brain or other elements of our celestial life. So this ability to have a soul that indicates on the existence of something greater. So Grange formulated it like that something big cannot result from something small. So the mind, the brain has to go as first one, because otherwise we will not be able to understand that. If we use language other than theological, but for example, the probability principle, a lot of philosophers do it when talking about theology. So the probability of creation of a world like ours, arranged in this manner, only based on the probability theory, it's impossible, because so many things have to happen at once and have to emerge at once that it is practically not possible. So this surplus, the fact that the being that we encounter is arranged and it's subject to so many rules, that indicates on the fact that somebody got offered this rule, somebody defined that rule, that there's one creator who is a smart, intelligent, wise person or being who governs the world as we can see it today. So this is on one hand. But atheists, as one of their most popular argument, they quote the fact that the New Testament was supposed to be written much later than we are told by the founding fathers of Catholic Church. So stories from the from the New Testament. So people knew that in order to, so people writing the Old Testament, they knew the story, so they wrote exactly what happened. And this is the argument that can work to the favor and could work in favor of Jesus and God. We're not talking about general theories or way of thinking. Up to now, we've been talking about something that merges all people, no matter whether you are Muslims, Jews, Christians. Thomas Aquinas, when carrying out research, he also referred to philosophers, to a Jewish philosopher of the 12th century. That causes that rationality of thinking is not linked to any concrete way people understand revelation, no matter whether it is in Judaism, Muslim, or Christianity. But a reference to fulfillment of prophecies is a fixed element of thinking from the very beginning. The Justin the Martyr, in dialogue with a Jew, Tryphon, in a book that was written in the 2nd century after Jesus Christ, that was the first attempt to tackle the issue, so to use prophecies as an argument in favor of the truthfulness of Christianity. When it comes to some modern philosophers who refer to that, we have Pascal. 1/3 of his thoughts, these are different prophecies, a few hundreds of them when Pascal says and tells how the prophecy was fulfilled. There is a book, this is a Jewish commentary to New Testament by David Stern, and he, by in-depth analysis and analysis of Old Testament prophecies, he presents how they got fulfilled. And the argument that you can find in books, in some advocacies of Judaism and some other researchers, what you've said, as you've said, we have a simple situation that the prophecy was fulfilled because the Christians knew about them in advance. Let's use an example. The Christians say that Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem, and as an evidence that the prophecy was fulfilled, they quote the Michaiah book. And you, Bethlehem, you are the smallest, and you will give birth to the one who will govern Israel. So that comes from around 7th century before Jesus Christ. So if he was born in Bethlehem, and they knew about it 700 years before, so that was, and the atheist will say, you came up with that he was born in Bethlehem. There's no evidence for confirming that. And I'm referring to that in my book. So what can be said not to refer to some concrete quotes and not to refer to some specific documents? This quote from Mikash is too weak to be sufficient to prove that somebody came up with the idea that Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem. In the Old Testament, we have a lot of prophecies, for example, indicating the Jerusalem as the place of birth for the new governor for the Messiah. The whole David's dynasty was issued from Jerusalem, and until Babylon destroyed the Judea, all kings were born there. So, guided by logic, if somebody wanted to come up with something, they wouldn't opt for some strange Bethlehem. Of course, now we know that it started a new era, but there was an arithmetic mistake that was committed 6 years before the first year of our era. Who would come up with such an idea to go back to this Bethlehem in the books and not to use the example of Jerusalem? That was the very city. It was the Mount of Zion, the sacred place, where the faith of Israel has its roots. So who would come up with something like that? I think that this is much better as an answer. Of course, somebody might say that how can we be 100% sure? Of course we cannot, because the historical data will not give us 100% certainty. We just evaluate the credibility of these documents. We put it in some context, we compare, and we carry out some reasoning with regard to their meaning. Apart from that, we try to compare and find out how different descriptions that we find in St. Matthew's and St. Lucas, how they merge. And the Bethlehem is present in both of them. How is it possible if there are so many different elements? There are two witnesses who describe this very moment of Jesus Christ's birth in the very same way. We can jump to a conclusion that one didn't read the dissertation of the other. We can see it that one author didn't know the description of the second one because they didn't try to reconcile the two versions. And so despite the fact that each of them separately put it down, they indicated the very same place. So the first element is that the topos of Jerusalem was not used, and it might have been used. And the second important element is that we have two witnesses writing in a very similar time, indicating the very same place. So thinking logically, we might jump to a conclusion that these descriptions are credible.
Wiarygodny.
Well, even in a penal process, one reliable witness is enough to see their statement as true confirmation of facts. But, you know, the four riders of the apocalypse, however they are called, by Richard Dawkins and his followers, this group tends to use the following argument. Jesus Christ was like many, similar to many. There were many prophets. They compare Jesus to Elvis Presley, who was also fashionable, and some call him a god. So what is the confrontation of this argument with historic facts? To what extent was Jesus Christ a unique hero, a unique person, and to what extent is it possible to use such comparisons? Well, you need to ask the following question. In general, we are all similar to one another, while at the same time we are all different. So the question is, what made him stand out, and to what extent he was similar to others? Going back to Dawkins, basically what he says is Christians made Jesus a God because he was charismatic, and since people were primitive and backwards then and uneducated, then since there was this extraordinary person, or at least had some skills that were extraordinary, at least interpreted as such back then, they presented him as the Son of God. Well, this argument is very anachronistic. That is, they project to the times of the first century of our era all their knowledge from the 20th and 21st century. The problem is that regardless of what we think about the ancient Jews in Israel and Judea, one thing made them stand out very strongly compared to their surrounding world. That is radical monotheism and radical rejection of any deification of human beings. And the fact that Jews starting treating him as a son of God, as a godly person, demonstrates that the whole thing cannot be described like it's being done by atheists, that he was later seen as a god, painted as a god. This makes no sense historically, because that means taking Jesus from his times, moving him to the 21st century and making him a celebrity, a star. It's easy to say, you know, you can say whatever, because paper is patient, but it makes no sense. The same could be said of the Carthaginians, to say that they lost against the Romans because they used jets. You could say that Carthaginians had if the Carthaginians had the air jets, jet planes, then Romans would die 700 years before. But yes, you would say, yes, it would be possible because it was enough to just use a drone in the first century before Christ. You know, it makes no sense. It's seen as complete fiction, and the same goes for that kind of argumentation. The real historic weight of the problem before a historian looking into the origins of Christianity boils down to how to understand Jesus Christ in his realities instead of moving him to the 21st century. How to explain that one who was contemporary to other Jewish teachers, and yet no other of these teachers that are enumerated in the Talmud, none of them, none of those wonder makers, because such have also been described, none was given a godlike character about their followers. And this is tried to be explained by reducing Jesus and his actions in that light. This is the problem that we are looking into precisely. Now, a rationalist might say, will say that
W książce dowody
they will say that resurrection is absurd. But we have so many testimonies. If so, then definitely Jesus' body, the corpse, was carried away then. So what about these many arguments about resurrection being completely fictional? Of course, if somebody decides upon their explanation are stubborn, you cannot convince them. I might say, I can't see you, I'm alone here, you're not here, ladies and gentlemen. You will say, no, but we are here. And I will say, no, you're not here because I've decided that you're not here. Then you will have to ask a special service to remove me from here. So the human mind has enormous potential, and it's difficult to deny that. If we're talking about resurrection and if rationalists were right, then we would have a huge number of such mentions in Greek, Roman, Jewish stories of people who were resurrected. And we would say that Jesus was just one of many cases. But the thing is that if we look into the history, that is, if we use sources from the period before the Gospels, or contemporary to the Gospels, because if we're talking about people who already knew Christianity, that makes no sense. That's what Hitchens and Dawkins do. But if we do what rational researchers do, that is, use documents from pre-Christian times and contemporary times to the Gospels, we will find no such mentions in Roman or Greek or Jewish sources. More, on top of that, in Jewish sources, we will see mentions of a resurrection at the end of time, and that would be universal resurrection at the end of world. So there is no text mentioning a single person being able to be resurrected in the middle of history, before the end of times. It would be like talking of one of our family members saying they're alive, not in the sense that they are hallucinating or that was in a dream. Instead, that person in their body, like they died, they are alive. Like for us, it's impossible to accept. So it was unacceptable to those people, and only coming to know Jesus Christ was it acceptable. And it's interesting because it's described in the Gospels in the 24th chapter of Luke's Gospel. There's the mention of women talking about the resurrection. That was women's gossip, they said. At that time, just gossip, and that was a natural reaction. That's how it was seen. If we take that point of view on the gospel, we will see that the contemporaries were surprised with what happened, and they did not know what to do about it. Nobody had informed them. If Jesus talked about his resurrection during his life, they interpret it as the belief of resurrection at the end of time. But they did not expect that to happen in year 30, in a specific reality. This non-linear character, this rupture, is a key argument. One more important thing that illustrates the authentic character of the gospel. All Gospels, all four Gospels, the members informed about the resurrection are women. This is very important because in the contemporary culture, Jewish culture of the time, but also Greek and Roman, and we have a lot of confirmations of that in documentation from the period, women were treated as untrustworthy witnesses. For example, during court proceedings, they cannot be called as witnesses because they were seen as untrustworthy in their testimonies. In the letter to the Corinthians, in the 15th chapter, witnesses are enumerated of the resurrection. There are only men. Peter, Jacob, the brothers, men only. That's because it's an official document, so to say. This is not a gospel. Gospels are the first documentaries of those events. They talk about the women, Mary Magdalene, for example. This shows that history, these historic events were not, elements were not added because they would come to the conclusion that it would be better to enumerate men, important persons, the apostles, etc. Because if you want to convince people, then you use arguments that will be effective. So I would try and synthesize as a rational argument for resurrection. If my understanding is correct, it would boil down to the following. If we assume the hypothesis of the atheists, that the whole Christianity is a big fat lie, it would be much easier to understand the whole thing without the element of resurrection. It would be easier to have the Christian religion without the resurrection, which was so difficult to believe at that time, especially if we add on top of that what happened after the crucifixion, that is, Christ's followers were hidden. They hid because they were afraid. And suddenly they come out and talk about the events. So something happened. Something had to happen. You might come to the conclusion, like the atheists, that they agreed upon it from the start. But apparently something happened for them to be ready to sacrifice their life in torture for spreading the word of Jesus Christ. Right, precisely. If we were in a courtroom where we were to justify an event that was difficult to believe, you would call on witnesses, check whether the testimonies are confirm one another. You will see whether the people seem trustworthy because they have no history of lie, for example. all the classical arguments, rational arguments that we use in a debate. The argument of women is very important. Very quickly was it captured by opponents of Christianity, which confirms its authenticity. Because already a pagan writer against Christians in the 2nd century used the following argument: how can you believe in resurrection and believe the testimony of one female historian, that is Mary Magdalene? So this demonstrates perfectly the fact that Christians like Luke, which is reflected in his in the style of writing, was a well-educated man. He understood that they understood that this testimony could be seen in such a way, and yet they did not drop it. They did not reject that formula. After the death of their master and teacher, they gathered. This primeval church started its activities in Jerusalem, while the only one that was from Jerusalem was Judah. So they all moved to Jerusalem because definitely their position in Galilee would have been much stronger if we're talking politics. Then in Jerusalem, where was the seat of the Jewish authorities that sentenced Jesus to death. So they must have seen what they were doing as fulfilling Jesus's order. Because what happened after the death of the teacher? Well, if not for the resurrection, they would run away, and everybody would go their own way. There's this historian that talked in the 3rd century after Christ about different Jewish leaders that had their groups of followers. Some of them even announced themselves as messiahs, kings, etc. And what did Romans do with such people? Well, they tried to capture them and sentence them to death, to kill the rebellion at the very start. None of those followers, none of these situations, none of these messiahs, so-called, were reported to resurrect. It's an old truth. It's not that after somebody's death they trusted somebody and started spreading the word of their teachings. Becoming a messiah in the Jewish tradition was becoming a follower of Jewish kings. So crucifixion should be the strongest argument against continuing in his following, not the other way around. So these thought patterns, if we follow these and move them to those times, are one after another, step-by-step arguments for the authenticity of the story of Jesus Christ. There's one more argument very often used by atheists. If God exists, why does he allow for so much evil? This is a completely different issue. And it goes back to the Augustine question of where does evil come from? I don't think that we have time to go into details of philosophy, of Christian philosophy, that wrestled with the problem of the existence of evil. Well, maybe just briefly we might say, sorry to interrupt you, If there was no evil, how could we differentiate good? Historically speaking, there's one thing that's true. One thing that I often see that is that the root reason is lack of faith is the source of evil, while evil is used as a way to justify the alleged inexistence of God. It's rather this way around. Many people having no contact with Christian religion, only following the pop culture around it, might come to the conclusion that Christianity is just a superstition without any rational basis. While if we were to enumerate just the most important ones, first we would have to weigh the cosmologic argument, that is, the world is so perfect that it's difficult to believe it happened by chance without the so-called designer. The second argument, if I understand correctly, is the ontologic proof that we talked about, then a historic proof that was talked about by you in detail. That is, if we look into historic sources, we will see that the story of Jesus Christ was exceptional for that time. And the number of witnesses and trustworthy witnesses. You talk about this in the book. Atheists saying that nobody knows the author of the gospel, etc. Well, it is not true. We know when the gospels were written, who wrote them. They are a series of trustworthy testimonies from those times. Would you like to add anything? And while we're summarizing, one more argument often used is the fact of the existence of church and its spread worldwide. This is an argument often used by St. Augustine. Alongside arguments of conscience and thinking, it was the argument of one church worldwide with the same faith and worshipping in the same way. Now, if we were to use that argument, this church is now present in even more territories, because it was not present in the Americas or Australia. So this is the additional argument that could be added on top. For such a conversation, we need an openness in the other party. My impression is that the stories by the very strongly promoted authors mean that people have heard something, they know something, then things start resonating, and they memorize arguments such as, nobody knows who wrote the Gospels and when they were written. And so this conversation requires that person to reject those stereotypes for just a minute and to make the effort of looking into the actual facts. Thank you very much. I think it will be nice to go back to this discussion. Thank you very much, dear editor. And now we invite you, ladies and gentlemen, to assist to the panel that is going to be a continuation of this interesting conversation.